Oh, okay, it's working. Perfect. Hello, everyone. We're about to start this session. Welcome, everyone, to this session entitled A Just Transition, Grounded in Human Rights, the Role of Businesses, here at the Swedish Pavilion at COP27. My name is Victor Bernard, and I'm the Program Officer specializing in human rights and environment at the Raoul Wallenberg Institute of Human Rights and Humanitarian Law, based in our Asia-Pacific office in Jakarta. I'm going to be moderating this session today, where we have distinguished speakers representing the business sector, the non-governmental organizations, and the youth group. Before we begin, I want to say a couple of words to set the stage for this session. We are hearing repeatedly that the effects of climate change that scientists have long predicted are now a reality, such as accelerated sea level rise, increasing incidence and intensity of disasters and extreme weather events, biodiversity loss and desertification. These threats risk destroying the natural systems and environmental services that 1.2 billion jobs around the world depend on. In addition, these impacts will have profound implications on a wide range of human rights, particularly those of the most vulnerable and future generations. In light of this, government and businesses must urgently find ways to transform key societal systems that drive environmental degradation and climate change, and rethink not just technologies and production processes, but also consumption patterns and ways of living. To enable this systemic change, to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, immediate and concerted actions are required, engaging diverse policy areas and actors across society. Such transformation is widely referred to as the green transition and has been discussed extensively in scientific studies and policy documents. This concept often refers to fundamental changes of key production and consumption systems like energy, transport, or agriculture and food, and are expected to substantially improve the state of our environment, but also the quality of people's lives, in particular those of the future generations. Moreover, accelerating the green transition would help preserve jobs dependent on ecosystem services and create new jobs in the green technology and sustainability fields. However, as historical and ongoing systems transitions show, such processes do not happen without trade-offs, conflicts, and resistance, since they disrupt and challenge established investments, jobs, behaviors, knowledge, and values, and can also have a significant human rights implication. For example, businesses that need to make transition out of greenhouse gas emissions greenhouse gas intensive production, and the workers who risk losing their jobs in climate mitigation processes are not always the ones who stand to gain from the considerable business opportunities from green economies. Also, industries that fuel the renewable energy boom have been associated with negative human rights impacts on communities and workers. These conditions gave rise to the widely discussed concept of just transition, which was initially championed by trade unions. Just transition entails business and governments navigating a complex web of interests and needs, aligning diverging views and ensuring that there is an inclusive social dialogue with all stakeholders, in particular workers and communities affected. It is a concept that is referenced in the 2005 Paris Agreement and incorporated into various ILO guidelines that envisage it as a systemic approach to sustainability. Over time, this concept has evolved and has been associated with different formulations, ranging from a narrow one that focuses on the needs for states and businesses to support workers and communities through putting in place robust social protection systems and job training, to a broader one that concerns systemic transformation that addresses deep injustices that render certain groups more vulnerable to human rights implications than others. As such, businesses play a central role not only to support the transition to a low carbon or zero carbon economy, but also to ensure that such a transition is just, equitable, and inclusive. This means that businesses should assess and address human rights implications when they plan and implement actions and strategies to address climate change. In this regard, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, the EU Mandatory Human Rights Environmental Due Diligence, and other EU-related initiatives such as the minimum safeguards under the taxonomy regulation can guide businesses and financial actors in embarking on a transition that is truly just and based on human rights. In this session, we're going to hear from a wide range of business representatives, especially in Sweden, who will share share initiatives and actions that they have taken to accelerate a just transition to a low-carbon economy. They will showcase ways their organizations have leveraged or can leverage business and human rights to avert and address potential human rights risks from climate mitigation and adaptation strategies. We also have speakers from the Institute on Business and Human Rights and Yango/Stockholm Plus 50 Youth Task Force, who will share their insights into their work on a just transition with businesses and other stakeholder groups. So first up, I'm honored to have Maria Simonsson, the head of sustainability at Swedish Credit, who will share her insights into the actions their companies have taken to accelerate a just transition. So the floor is yours.
Hello. It's on. So thank you, and thank you for inviting me to speak at this very important topic. At SEK, we're a financer, we're a bank. We finance Swedish exporters. We also finance their suppliers, and we finance the buyers of these products. When we do this, it means we're out in 60 different countries, which means taking in all these aspects. So our starting point is that we work with sustainability from a holistic perspective we're in the business of risks, so we need to assess all the risks there are, including the ones that you mentioned, which means that we've had this as an integral part of our due diligence on projects and companies when we lend to them. And all the different initiatives and the international frameworks that you referred to, we work with, such as the IFC performance standards, we work with the OECD guidelines, and we see that increasingly this is now also coming in through regulation in the EU. And since we're a regulated business, this means that this is going to be hardwired into the financial system. And that hardwiring will enable us to find the language and find the criteria and find the appropriate assessments for these quite complex topics. We're working a lot on this. We're working to integrate it into our analysis, into our policies, but also into our products in that sense. The former panel was speaking about transition. The just transition is about also recognizing these kind of values. And one thing that we do a lot is infrastructure projects that has to do with communities and people, and thereby also human rights is relevant. And we see also, which is very promising, that Swedish companies are actually taking action on this and leading the way. But there's a lot more work to do, and we're committed to work with our customers on this topic.
Thank you so much for giving that very interesting overview of how financial institutions are now being regulated by an escalating regulatory framework. And I would also love to hear more about how you are working with infrastructure projects on making sure that this transition benefits all. I'm going to move on to our next speaker, who will be joining us online, I assume. Her name is Ms. Christina Friborg, who is the Executive Vice President and Head of Sustainability at SSAB, which is the Swedish steel company. She too will share some insights into the work they're doing in support of the Just Transition agenda. The floor is yours, Ms. Christina.
Thank you, Victor, and thank you so much for inviting us to this arena. Looking forward to the continued discussions also ahead of us. As you said, SSAB is a steel producer. We have a turnaround of about 96 billion Swedish crowns. We have about 14,000 employees, and our main production sites are in Sweden, Finland, and the United States. We also account for 10% of Sweden's CO2 emissions and 7% of Finland's CO2 emissions. So we are one of the bad guys, really, in Sweden until now. Our input materials are iron ore and scrap. So we produce steel from scrap in the US, but in Finland and Sweden we produce steel from iron ore. When you produce steel from iron ore, you need a blast furnace, and this is where all the CO2 emissions occur. We will electrify, and when we do this, we will install electric arc furnaces, such as we already have in the US. However, that takes scrap as input material, but there is not scrap enough in the world to supply the global demand for steel, so we will need to produce steel from iron ore within a foreseeable future. This is why we have researched and found that we can make iron ore-based steel from by using hydrogen gas instead, hydrogen. This is why we created Hybrid, which is a value chain initiative together with our iron ore supplier LKAB and our energy supplier Vattenfall, where we have done research and we have actually been able to produce steel without fossil emissions. Our aim is to have fossil-free steel in commercial production in 2026, which is quite soon, and also be largely fossil-free in the company at around 2030. So we are accelerating really our agenda here. For the human rights issues, of course, this comes with a responsibility. The whole company is transforming right now, and this, of course, creates a little bit of a stir. I have to say we have a very large wave of understanding and engagement from our employees. But it does create a little bit of a stir. So of course, human rights will be taken into account when doing this transition. The transition is huge. The whole company is affected. All our sites, more or less, are affected in different grades. Now, the main focus in this transition is our employees and the societies in which we operate. One of the founding basic things that we did to do this was to update our code of conduct with the relevant human rights regulations and guidelines that were mentioned by you, Victor. And when it comes to the priorities, really, I would like to highlight the work on health and safety of our employees, but also of our contractors that will work on the sites that we have. This is a true priority for us. We've gone from 4.2 in LTI in lost time injury frequency in 2018 until 1.15 now in the latest quarterly report for the third quarter this year. So we've really done a fantastic job when it comes to the safety of our own employees and contractors, and this will remain a key priority for us. And this is, to me at least, closely linked to human rights and the right to a safe workplace and so on. And the same thing with the health issue. They are very interrelated. We also, for the just transition, of course, the competence development is key for this. We will develop the competence and train our employees as much as we possibly can. We have, for example, started a historically large project in Luleå, which is one of our sites, that will start in 2023. We've started the planning already, where we will have training directed specifically and explicitly towards electricians, for example, so that they understand how this electrification of the way we produce steel will continue, so that at least that group from the start will be prepared. So this is just one concrete example of how we will work with just transition, but obviously the whole company will be affected, and we will take care of competence development in many other areas also. Other basic human rights that we have to take into account, and which we do sort of as a regular basis, but that we will keep a close eye on also, is for example, the choice to unionize or the choice not to unionize, and also have a close dialogue with the unions, particularly in Sweden and Finland. And also, for example, the freedom from discrimination, which is also a big issue when you need to recruit a lot of new employees for the future. Victor, do you want us to also talk about the challenges, or shall we come back to those?
Yeah, I will come back to you about the challenges. I'll also let the others, you mentioned a number of very interesting good practices that can contribute or that will contribute to a just transition. So I will also let the other business representatives highlight a couple of them in the next round. So I will hold you back there a little bit. But you mentioned a couple of things that I found very interesting, especially with regards to human rights. I remember just last year, human rights was a very sensitive topic to mention, just to utter those words. And now we're seeing more and more businesses incorporating it into their due diligence and practices, and also referencing the business and human rights frameworks. So I'm very happy to hear that and linking it to the climate change, the climate action that each business will need to take. So just moving on to our next speaker, who represents Tetra Pak, Ms. Eja Hietabuo. Sorry, I might have slaughtered your name, but I look forward to hearing you give an overview of the measures taken by Tetra Pak to accelerate a just transition. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me? No? Can you hear me now? Yes. Very good. Thank you. You make me sound very exotic with your pronunciation of my name, which is a blunt, old-fashioned Finnish name, so it's Eija Hietavuo. So maybe to get that right. Tetra Pak is easier to pronounce. And for those of you who don't know Tetra Pak, or you know Tetra Pak for the fact that it's about packaging, I'd maybe like to start off by also telling you a bit about Tetra Pak, because not only we are one of the world's largest packaging companies, but we are also one of the world's largest food-related processing solutions, technology, and equipment manufacturers. So it's actually quite a big responsibility we have in the food industry. And to add to that, we also are very big in the dairy business, so the world's largest. So it's an interesting combination of responsibilities when you think of just transition or green transition overall. And as food is so central in our work, and you know that was the foundation really of the company, it's also the center in our sustainability agenda. And this is really scary, the sounds, but I hope we'll survive. So food is the center of our agenda, and if you would like to kind of imagine a flower growing from the food in the center, you would see that it sort of intersects with climate, nature, and circular economy, and social sustainability and responsibility is cutting across all those areas. And I think this is really important. You know, we've been working on environmental issues, and that was basically the foundation of the company to come up with these low carbon circular packaging products in particular, which have special features because they use technologies which are very unique. It's called aseptic technologies, which allow food to be preserved for a longer time by very quick super hot heating technologies, and therefore the cartons actually they reduce food loss and food waste in the processing and in the use of food. So therefore, you know, when we talk about green transition for the packaging business, it's been kind of incubate from day one. And for the processing business, what we are more and more now invested in is technologies and solutions on alternative proteins to replace animal proteins, or at least to offer both sides, if you like. And I think maybe you don't know, but we also are very advanced in having these product development centers at Tetra Pak. So we work with our customers and sometimes non-customers to develop the kind of food products, so design food products that would be fit to a certain country or geography, or with certain supply chains, which wouldn't depend on, for instance, soy for plant-based products, but could depend, for instance, on hemp, which nowadays grows happily in Sweden because of the weather changes. So this just to explain a bit our business, and therefore we take our responsibility very seriously when you look into the human part of the transition as well. So maybe to start off with, I'll just give you a couple of examples on our supply chain related actions, because human rights overall, our journey with human rights started as most companies, actually, it started with the supply chain responsibility. So that's, of course, as we heard from SSAB as well, about the code of conducts on suppliers, being, certifications like the SEDEX certification, EcoVadis, which require human rights compliance. But we also have big transitions to do in some of our supply chains. So these are green transitions. So when we talk about packaging, we, of course, we want to secure that the raw materials which we use in our packaging are extremely sustainable and respect human rights. So we've opted for FSC certification for all our wood-based products, which actually means that FSC is one of those certification schemes which actually incorporates human rights in the process. It looks into local communities, FPIC, and other things. So it's quite mature as an environmental certification standards. We are also members, one of the first members in the Aluminium Stewardship Initiative, which yet again looks into indigenous people's rights and where aluminium is concerned. So these are just some of the actions which are very direct. But then I would actually like to already now, I know that this wasn't the time for challenges, but I would also like to talk about our work in the kind of direct work of our area. So as you know, packaging is a huge kind of circular economy topic, which has resulted not only in massive amounts of regulation around the world, but the discussions of a plastics treaty currently, many initiatives led by foundations and is this working? Yeah. So led by multi-stakeholder platforms, NGOs, etc. And circular economy is a great example. Like I think we've heard about some environmental initiatives, which has so far only focused on environmental benefits that circularity is going to deliver. And I think this is one is very prevalent for us because, of course, as a responsible company, we want to make sure that all the packaging that we bring to market.
Number 2.
All the packaging that is brought to market by our customers, it actually gets also recycled. And this aspiration is very far in terms of when developed markets are concerned. But in the developing world where you don't have the infrastructure in place, it is very difficult to do that. And you need collective action. You need to work with policymakers, governments, communities, cities to drive that action. And very often in these areas, you are dependent on informal waste collection, we are dependent on informal waste collection infrastructure, or where that doesn't exist, you actually would be developing that. And this is an area where we have been active in many countries, and there are great examples from some countries. But this is a topic that I would like to suggest for further discussion. How do we ensure that great environmental initiatives where you have a lot of collective action, where you have the UN supporting, you have civil society engaged, you have academia in those initiatives. So how can we bring this just transition and the elements of human rights into these initiatives as opposed to driving this separately?
Sorry. Can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you so much, Ms. Eija. Yes. For your very interesting insights into not only the opportunities but also the challenges. You preempted my question there later on. So, but Tetra Pak is of course one of the biggest companies, and we see it all across Asia in the packaging industry. And you mentioned a number of interesting innovations, especially in the technological front, that I do think that we can explore further and see how we can couple that with human rights later on. Next up, we have Institute on Business and Human Rights, Ms. Haley Dennis, who is going to introduce her work on just transitions. She comes from a non-governmental organization, and she can probably talk extensively about how businesses work on just transitions in other parts of the world, especially in South Africa. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? These microphones are very scary.
Thank you very much, Victor. My name is Haley St. Dennis. I'm with the Institute for Human Rights and Business, IHRB. Just to say a word about who IHRB is, we're a think and do tank, we often describe ourselves as. We were founded in 2009. Our founding chair at the time was Mary Robinson, of course, a very well-known climate justice advocate for many decades. And we really try to work at the intersection of business, government, and civil society, really as a sort of agitator for collective action on some of these very systemic issues. And I don't think there is a greater collective action challenge than the just transition and how to move forward in a very concrete way against some very, very tight timelines in terms of our climate targets. So I was going to, Victor, take a slightly higher level perspective and really, I think, try to share some tensions that we're observing around the sort of state of play of just transitions globally right now. And I think there is a tension and a moment that we're in because there has been, very much thanks to the pioneering work of trade unions and the ILO, significant uptake of the just transitions concept, particularly, I would say, since COP26 over the last 12 months or so, by financial institutions, businesses across sectors, industry associations, which is absolutely what's needed. But there has also been a huge array of definitions and interpretations of how they're understanding what just transitions really means, how they're defining that J element within this sort of JT acronym. And there's a risk that comes with that, where you have an increase in sort of misuse or misapplication of this very visionary concept, such that there is a risk, I think, in the near future of it becoming a potentially meaningless term. Because if just transition means everything to everyone, then it also means nothing at all. So to illustrate that, I was recently in Cape Town about 3 or 4 weeks ago for a knowledge sharing dialogue that the Presidential Climate Commission and the African Climate Foundation were putting on around their just transition path. And they, of course, I think everyone probably knows, are sort of the leading model, national model for how to decarbonize at scale in a way that also brings communities, brings workers and consumers along and really tries to tackle inequality at the same time as tackling the decarbonization challenge. And South Africa, of course, has a very extensive decarbonization challenge. So it was an incredibly inspiring couple of days. There was a huge amount to share. They have a very visionary just transition framework in South Africa, and I think very much rooted in their post-apartheid history, the understandings of the sort of three forms of justice: procedural, distributive, and historic sort of reparative. But they also sought to expand this knowledge sharing session to one of South Africa sharing globally with a number of other countries that are at slightly later inflection points, but looking very much to emulate the South African model. So they had Indonesia there, Vietnam, the Philippines, and a number of other African countries. And so as the dialogues went on, particularly with these countries sharing their ambitions, their visions of how they saw just transition in their country playing out, we at IHRB played that slightly awkward role of asking the human rights question. What do you mean by J when you say just transition? And the interpretations varied widely. And in many ways, I think they reflected visions of structural economic inequality, right? Access to finance was very much seen as one country's definition of just transition. The ability to continue tapping into their oil and gas reserves was another interpretation of what just transition meant in that context. And so we challenge, particularly from a human rights perspective, the risks of this playing out as we move forward over the coming months, because at least on two levels, as I say, it raises real risk of this visionary concept losing its power. One is around this question of quality control, understanding what just transitions is in order to be able to measure against a baseline and understand progress in achieving just transitions, which is a long-term change management systemic process. The other, I think, is around co-option. And I think just the fact that there is already an acronym, right, JETP, Just Energy Transition Partnerships, is a signal of where this could potentially be headed. So I suppose what I'll leave with for now, but come back with a much more positive set of comments, I guess, around where we see things needing to go forward is really just to challenge, I think, everyone in the room that if, I guess, JT and JETP are to avoid going the way of CSR and ESG, it is absolutely critical that we develop collectively some forms of quality control over that J element moving forward. And happy to share further thoughts on what we think that could look like, Victor.
Well, thank you so much, Haley. I mean, that was some of the impressions I got doing research on this topic. The J, the just, has so many different definitions depending on who you speak with and where they come from and which group they belong to. And this is, of course, something we can unpack later on, because it is a challenge having multiple definitions, but without a standardized way of quality assuring whether your processes and your production is contributing to this so-called just transition. I want to move on to our last speaker, who is Ms. Yoko Liu, who represents Yango and the Stockholm Plus 50 task force. She will specifically talk about the Stockholm Plus 50 because they came out with an interesting youth policy paper that covered just transition. But I'll let her talk more about that now. So the floor is yours, Yoko.
Thank you for introducing me to the floor and inviting me to as a speaker. So my name is Yoko Liu. So I'm part of the Stockholm Plus 50 Youth Task Force member, which we attended the Stockholm Plus 50 conference in June 2nd and 3rd this year. And we developed a youth task force, a policy paper that invited the youth from all across the world to include their inputs into our policy paper, including the just transition and business, and as well as human rights. So I will read off some notes from the document. So for the Stockholm Plus 50 conference, there were 3 different themes. So the first one was reflection on the urgent need for actions to achieve a healthy planet and prosperity of all. So within this particular theme, in terms of just transition, we proposed that a nature positive goal for 2030 with respect to biodiversity and a goal for chemical pollution and water should be set at Stockholm Plus 50 alongside the existing target to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees for an inclusive and just transition to a nature positive economy. And within human rights, we propose that we should recognize the rights to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment in domestic legal systems by integrating it in national constitutions and legislations, and vote in favor of recognition to this matter in the UNGA, which was already passed. And the second one is achieving a sustainable and inclusive recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. And we propose under just transition to ensure constructive implementation measures and just transition, promoting socio-economic equity during and beyond the COVID-19 pandemic. And under human rights, introduce mandatory greenhouse gas reporting, human rights and environmental due diligence laws for listed corporations, and a legally binding international treaty to cover global trade and supply chains, and also accelerate progress towards a proposed UN binding treaty on business, human rights, and environment. And the third theme was accelerating the implementation of the environmental dimension of sustainable development in the context of the decade of action. And within this, we would like to phase out the subsidizing exploration, extraction, and utilization of all fossil fuels to achieve net negative emissions by 2050, following the principles of a just transition and common but differentiated responsibilities. To facilitate this transition, we also proposed to establish an international fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty to immediately stop all further expansion of fossil production. And finally, to ensure for the theme for Stockholm 50 was to ensure an inclusive process for decision making. And we want to highlight that we want to recognize that achieving sustainable and inclusive development through democratic processes needed to take all perspectives and opinions into consideration via the principles of free speech and press freedom. We also call upon world leaders to recognize the right to free and fair elections in accordance with international human rights. So this is from a youth perspective, so it's also very important to include the youth voice in human rights, justice, and business, because within this business world, it's really difficult to talk about human rights because youth is the beginning and opening door to this career and also the green jobs and just transition. Because within young, actually, I'm also with young girl, that we also really want to call for these green transitions and really accelerate this just transition into business field, and that it's very important to include youth into all aspects. So it's not just about the business, but also human rights perspective. I think that's it for now.
All right, thank you so much for that very interesting, spiel or overview of what they have been achieved, or what they have achieved as of or until Stockholm Plus 50. And that paper, and I invite you all to read it. The position paper includes very interesting calls for various, measures, especially trying to reach or trying to stem global temperature from exceeding 1.5 degrees. Human rights is also explicitly mentioned, but most importantly, that youth groups and youth, the very people that this crisis will affect, are included in all of these decision makings that businesses and also decision makers are taking on their behalf. So with this, I'm going to open up the floor. So I'll first ask a question, but then I'll let you guys mull any particular questions that you may have for our speakers, and then I'll go around with a microphone. So I'll open up the Q&A by asking, first of all, the business the business representatives to highlight one cutting-edge innovation or good practice, and I know that some of you have already done so already, but highlight just briefly one cutting-edge innovation or good practice that you think is promising in the achievement of just transition that your company has taken, and also highlight one dilemma or challenge that you feel is being insufficiently discussed or considered in these talks. So I'm going to go back to our colleague from SEK, Miss Maria, to give her take from a financial point of view.
Yes, it's live. Yes. So I'm going to continue where I left off. So I think that the business, we're in the financial sphere, which is the real economy, where the change is happening and the real will change. Okay, so moving away from this one, thanks. I think that you touched upon it before, like the projects that we finance going into other countries, the way that those projects are structured around also having these topics aligned with IFC performance standards, OECD guidelines, going back to the UN Global Compact, that is the start where we need to start addressing it. So that is something we've been doing for several years. We can see that it's improving in a way that you get more and more recognition of also the human rights elements. You have, for instance, if you have a railroad, you have landowners' rights, you have indigenous peoples' rights, you have all these elements of building that from a societal point of view, which again involves people. So there are various instruments that you use in these kind of transactions where human rights is a specific part of that due diligence. If I just move over to the topic of this conference, which is the climate transition, I would say that we're also looking into, in the finance industry, as from an investor point of view, understanding the systemic risks, also broadening that from what does it means if we have social exclusion and social inequalities, what does that mean from a systemic risk perspective? There are also, when you analyze a company and the ability to create value over time, what are the material value drivers from the social elements and the human rights elements? Because companies produce products that is taken up by consumers. You have workers, you have the supply chain workers. If you don't deal with these topics, it's going to be material deteriorating for you. So from an investment point of view, it is not insignificant. And it's one part of that is that we're financing companies and we're picking up the funding in the international capital markets. And so our investors are increasingly asking us, so your green assets here, how are they produced? What are the elements of social and human rights in that? And so we're seeing that also from the asset owner side and the investor side, which means that we need to transfer that into our projects and our loans. So in that sense, I think that the financial markets, which is also a key topic of this conference, right? The implementation will also come from understanding if I'm going to lend money or if I'm going to invest, what are the social elements of that? Which brings me into the next question you had there with dilemmas. I think that what we are still to work out is exactly what you were speaking. What does it mean to have a just transition? And I think what everyone here has sort of signed up to be part of solving the knot on how to do this. And I think that this is a complex transformation of multi-stakeholder dimensions. So we're going to need super high strategic planning capacities, and we're going to have to keep all these elements going at the same time, which means that we cannot wait for another decade and then talk about the just transition. I think that the transition we're already made for 200 years, where we had access to cheap energy, which brought us into a fossil-dependent economy. Now we're going to do the next transformation, and let's not redo the mistake where we didn't think about the societal aspect of when we built the economic surroundings. So I think that's where I would like to see. We talk a lot about the policy and the call-outs for government to take policy actions on green. I think we also, at least the country we're in, the pavilion of Sweden, we have a long legacy of looking into social policy. How can we connect the social policy with the green policy initiatives that are coming? So that we get it all the way around, because we need it integrated, we need it not as a separate track, because this will drive value creation and it will drive the long-term sustainability of companies, businesses and organizations, and ultimately societies. So that would be my call to action. Make sure that the social policy element is also in there when you create your transition policies.
I just wanted to say a quick word, because I totally agree. And what is incredible is, I think you spoke about the EU policy and the amazing things that Mr. Timmermans and his troops have been doing, creating a kind of a framework which is really cross-cutting, etc. But then when you start looking at the human rights bits and pieces, it's all sort of it's in their silos, and I think that's one of the challenges also when we talk about just transition. Are we talking about the implementation of the UN guiding principles of business and human rights, or are we talking about something else and which is transformational and needs to be integrated? I think it's the latter, but how to put that in writing is I guess the challenge.
I mean, excellent intervention there. And I want this to be an interactive session, so feel free to jump in if anybody wants to pose a question or make a comment. But I completely agree with you. There is a number of challenges that we have treating these two issues separately, but at least we are now seeing the problem. Previously, we used to ignore the fact that social and human rights were relevant or are affected by climate issues, but now we are recognizing it, but moving forward, and I think my non-business counterparts will talk about it, moving beyond, incorporating human rights and climate as two parallel areas into a business conduct or into their business practices. We need to move beyond that and also look at how transformation can happen. But that we can talk about later. So I'll give the floor to Ms. Christina, and I know you have mentioned a couple of interesting good practices that you have taken within SSAB, especially on the unionization or the choice not to be part of a union, but also human rights due diligence and so forth. But if you want to highlight a particular achievement that you are proud of in that would contribute or that you consider contributing to a just transition, feel free to highlight that. But most importantly, the challenges. What are the challenges? What is a challenge that SSAB is currently facing that you think are not being covered in these discussions? The floor is yours.
Small issues, Victor.
Yeah.
Actually, I work for a company in the midst of a transition or in the beginning of a long transition journey. And what we are really proud of is the creation of this fossil-free value chain that we want to create together with our partners, being iron ore suppliers and energy suppliers, but now also attaching customers such as Volvo and Polestar and other large companies. Now, in doing this in a trustworthy way, we also, of course, need to take care of the social part, but also the economic part of the sustainability agenda, being it human rights, being it or anti-corruption and all of that. Of course, that's a compliance issue, but also engagement in society. So we see this as a full package rather than separate issues in order to be trustworthy. Now, when it comes to pure implementation, basically, how do we go about doing this? Because we're in the midst of it. It's about how do we purchase new equipment, how do we communicate with our employees, how do we make sure and reassure our companies that, or our employees that they will be safe, not only safe from a physical perspective, but also safe in their employment. And that's why I mentioned the unionization. And I also mentioned the anti-discrimination, or the freedom from discrimination, because when you recruit people, we need to recruit from a really wide group of people, and women and men. Right now we don't have we have 20% women and 80% men approximately, which is just not good enough, so we need to work on that. We have specific programs targeting that, but also, diversity from a larger perspective, which means that the anti-discrimination policy that we have, the non-tolerance for that, is really, really important. Communication with our employees is crucial in reaching this sort of sense of security and safety in the company. We mentioned codes of conduct and supply chain work and all of that, and to us this is really hygiene work, so of course we work on all of these things too. But in a company like ours in transition, all of this needs to be in place. But right now, when change is happening, we need to direct our focus towards our employees. And as you know, when you're changing and there's a lot of construction on big sites and so on, I return to safety, health and safety for our employees, which is a human right that is not discussed very often. I didn't mention this in the beginning, but I am actually a human rights lawyer leading the sustainability department in SSAB. So we do have the social aspect continuously present in all our work. Now, when it comes to the challenge, it has been mentioned here in passing by. We speak about these frameworks and the directives from the European Union coming on the human rights due diligence and all of those things. I would just like to raise a little finger as a legally trained person into taking these instruments and the guidelines and turning them immediately into legal texts, because they were not formulated that way in the beginning, such as the guiding principles on business and human rights, for example. They are not legal texts as they are. So when developing these instruments, we have nothing against it, we welcome it. But when this is done, it really has to be carefully analyzed and particularly carefully worded in order for this to be implementable for the future. So that's something that I would like to raise.
Thank you. Oh. Hello? Yes. Okay. Thank you so much for that very interesting intervention. Yes, indeed. We have also talked about that extensively, of how practical the existing frameworks are and how grounded they are in the realities that many businesses face across the world. Of course, these, not be coming to the UN guiding principles defense, but those principles are supposed to be hammered down or supposed to be contextualized through the National Adaptation Action Plan on Business and Human Rights. So hopefully Sweden will develop one that really addresses those gaps that you mentioned or underscored in your intervention. But we can talk about that more later on. So I just want to turn to our last business speaker, Ms. Eija. I'm so sorry, I'm still struggling with the name, but so you can definitely, you mentioned a couple of good practices and also challenges in your intervention, but if you want to highlight one particular one from each, feel free. The floor is yours.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Yes? Yeah. Maybe just to bridge on some of the things said here first. I was very privileged to have worked on the UN Guiding Principles and Business during my years at the UN, and I will still remember Professor Aragi's kind of short, very snappy things which helped business to understand human rights in basically to have any clue of what these guidelines meant. And I also I worked at UNICEF in trying to translate these guidelines of what does it mean, what's the business responsibility in terms of children. So I think looking at that backdrop and knowing how much the UN system and civil society has actually tried to also emphasize the connection between human rights and environment, it's a pretty sad situation we're in, actually. And maybe we need some very smart translators who speak the language of business, which is going to allow for guidelines which are going to help us do the dummied down version. But that's maybe something to discuss, what would be those tools, etc. But what I wanted to come back to in terms of our work in this area was circular economy. And as you all know, and you can live through also in your day-to-day lives, some of the really big kind of tools for green transition that EU policy and global policy has brought over, they link to circular economy. With the resource scarcity we have in the world, you really need to think of alternative ways of consumption and end of life of products so that they are, they circle and they are reusable or at least recyclable and new business models. And what we are doing at Tetra Pak is, of course, our journey started with packaging and ensuring its circularity. So that's really been in the limelight, and we have like 70 sustainability professionals around the world working on securing circularity. And of course, the driver has been very much the environmental issues, because if you don't recycle a carton, then you miss that CO2 at the end of it. So it's really important on that. But equally, the further you go, and you don't have to go away from Europe. Actually, in some of EU member states, the waste management system already runs partially on informal labor. So I know it from discussions with ILO. It's a super sensitive, very challenging area. And the further you go from the developed world, informality increases. And so how do you, as a business, secure that human rights are respected? How do you transition? Because this is about green transition. This creates jobs. It brings people out from poverty. It's social inclusion. It's minimum salaries or at least some kind of livelihoods improved, children's rights addressed because you avoid child labor. There are all those aspects that we would like to see. And there are collective actions in this area, but still it's deemed as an area which you should be ashamed of, even though that billions in the world are pouring into plastics and all of that. So that would be the challenge for you, Victor, to solve, and then we could all sleep better overnight and secure that people are happy and we address this.
And just building on that, I think that it was just fairly recently we actually learned that pollution, not being polluted, is a human right. So that is also something to bear in mind if we don't succeed with this. We were speaking about we want carbon taxer, pollution pays. Well, the backdrop of that is that there are humans and their rights are being violated. So you also need to act in it because you have to. And I think the more recognition those kind of topics get, we're also going to get increasingly pressured unless we don't do anything. So the pollution part, I think, was interesting now when this came out.
Perfect. I'm glad that you raised that issue, but I'm also sorry to say that me alone will not be able to resolve this very big issue of unsustainable business practices, or of trying to expand just transition to also cover those social aspects that you mentioned. I'm really interested to hear what Ms. Haley and Yoko would like to say, hearing from what you just heard with regards to the challenges and opportunities. You also mentioned an area that I think is worth mentioning. Human rights is also developing alongside climate change. So now we have the right to a healthy environment. You mentioned that the right to live in a society where you can breathe clean air, drink safe and potable drinking water, eat sustainable food. all of that is part of this new right to a healthy environment, which was recognized by the UN General Assembly just recently. And this is something that will give standing in court for many groups and many civilians who are being affected by pollution on a daily basis. But with the interest of time, I would like to move on to our non-business speakers. Hearing from what you just heard, what is your best advice to businesses here today to ensure that that they can engage in this just transition, let's say, journey, and what do you think needs to be done moving forward?
Can you hear me? Testing. Okay. I mean, it's a big question. It's been a really heartening conversation, actually, and I really empathize with businesses that are beginning to grapple with this concept, because I don't think it's very clear what's expected of you yet. And it can be quite scary to put your head above the parapet. And a lot of guidance to date on just transitions is primarily targeting national and local authority policymakers that are beginning to try and establish just transition frameworks within their national context. And it's also very worker-centric. It's very much focused on the skills transition. And that's understandable, because this concept has been pioneered by the trade union movement, and workers stand to lose or gain a great deal as the world decarbonizes. But so too do communities and consumers. And so I guess my hope taken from this conversation is already how holistic it has been to understand businesses really grappling with what this means in terms of local communities, indigenous peoples, children, and otherwise, and the other potentially affected groups that need to be brought along the way. So certainly that is the starting point, I think, for any company that I speak to, is making sure you undertake that holistic view. And you asked a little bit about, the guiding principles on business and human rights and how far do they get you down this journey. And I think it's an excellent starting point. And if every company just sought to implement their human rights responsibilities through a risk management process, it does take you very, very far down that pathway. But not the whole way, as far as this very visionary context and the very complex structural change that's to come if it's truly brought to life. And so we certainly see that as being one of at least 4 essential elements for what this could look like from a sort of standardization approach moving forward. The other being the flip side of the risk coin, which is opportunities, and really ensuring that within any design of a just transition framework or strategy of a company, how do you know that this really will lead workers to being better off than they were before? How do you know that this will leave communities in a better place? How do they understand it? What are their needs moving forward, and ensuring that you're delivering on those? Because without that, you will never have the bottom-up support required from your consumer base, from your communities, from your workers, that is needed for this to actually become real. And I'll just illustrate with an example of a farmer representative that I was speaking to, who sort of said, farmers are in survival mode right now. They are only thinking about today. They don't have the luxury of thinking about tomorrow. And so build back better means nothing to them if you're already building back to poverty. It's really, if a farmer will get more financial incentive from cutting down a tree, they won't be able to take mind of our, deforestation targets. So how do you change that incentive for that farmer as part of your transition as a company? That is the flip side of the risk coin. And I would say 2 other essential elements to that help you deliver on that. One is around agency and accountability, and really it's the procedural rights piece within all of this, and ensuring that these different affected groups have agency in the process. And so that is really leaning into their rights to collective bargaining, their rights to freedom of expression, their rights to free, prior, and informed consent as very unique indigenous groups with that specific right, and ensuring that through those procedural justice processes, accountability is a part of that equation, so that when you commit to just transition, it means something. And the fourth and final, I would say, is one that's really around this broader structural systemic change piece, and ensuring that this isn't just a kilowatt for kilowatt transition. It's not just like for like, but it is really redesigning something. And your circular economy model is a great case in point, which I think often the sort of social implications of circular design is very much taken for granted. It's seen as good, right? So it can't inherently have ills that need to be managed or social imperatives that need to be realized. And so really thinking through how that transformational piece fits within your very specific role in this complex ecosystem will be key. And so IHRB, certainly as a think tank, and the role we try to play is to agitate toward greater comparability and quality control moving forward, we'll be doing that across the suite of standards that we think are relevant here. And I think Christina mentioned how challenging it can be to translate something like the guiding principles into a standard. Just transitions is even harder, I would say. So I don't think there is one single standard that could ever be created for this, but it's really looking at the sort of supply, demand, and finance drivers that are together creating the direction that we're heading down, and how do you elevate the social content and criteria within those in a way that creates more harmony, whether on the finance side that's the TCFD or the EU taxonomy, within the sort of demand side it might be the climate pledge, and within the supply side it's thinking about the transition out and the transition in, and ensuring that social criteria base is there, and having all those, I think, speak to each other.
That's a very interesting, your interventions are very enlightening to me, at least. Building back better doesn't mean anything if they're pushed it back into the poverty they came from. So I take that with me as a good quote from this session. I just want to give you Yoko the floor to share her recommendations to our business counterparts here today.
Hello. Yeah. Okay. So thank you for all the interventions from also the non-business and the business. So it was mentioned before, the pollution and everything else is really connected to human rights, even though we don't really term this human rights in our everyday text or our conversation, but everything's really connected to human rights. And also the youth and young people, children, they're really the today's generation that really brings all of these recommendations and our challenges, opportunities to future generations that really want to empower the future generations through the intergenerational equity. And also, it's really important to have capacity building and all these education opportunities as well from business, because the business sector can be also not something that we can think of when we work in these different sectors, including environment and the social aspects that really into enhance this human rights and social justice and everything into our thinking. And also to all this, for example, the young goal is the youth constituency. The UMCCC, we're developing this policy paper, but with the young goal, we also have different working groups and different thematics, not just to the UMCC process, that's adaptation, loss and damage, for example, but we also have the working groups into the green jobs, which is just transition, and also energy, water, human rights, vice versa. And we all really work together and also to put these inputs, and also really need to enhance more into the business sector as well. That it would be really beneficial that the business sector can really include youth, for example, and to really have the perspectives from business and how that impacts on the youth, and also really have, for example, have more internships and for more traineeships of not just university students but also high school students, and really to touch how they really have an impact on climate change as well, because business is business, but it's also very important to have really connections between all this, for the UMCCC, and how all of this bring together, and also from the youth, from the vulnerable communities, and also from those most affected by climate change, and really have international business and how what they do also have impact on this youth, even though they're not from the global north, for example, but from global south countries that mostly affected by climate change, for example, also including the social aspects, economic aspects, and everything together. and also with academia, because the youth is from schools, and also it's very important to include the institutions that mostly deal with that work on climate change and business together, and really highlight human rights in the youth and everyone, so that no one is left behind.
Perfect. The multi-stakeholder engagement that you mentioned, including youth especially, is definitely important. I remember we had a conversation over the phone about the measures that companies are taking to decarbonize their processes and their economies. Is actually affecting youth in particular, because they are at the lower end of the career path. So they'll probably be the ones, in case the company has to shift or downsize, they're the ones who will be affected first. So having a system in place that really enables them to find a new way or a new job, reskilling, being retrained to different positions is of course important. So that's something that's stuck with me after our conversation, and especially people from the global south, excluding, I mean, of course, global south meaning developing and least developed countries. Those are the youth that will also be disproportionately affected, segueing perfectly into the concept of intersectionality. But I just want to open the floor up to Q&A. If anybody has any questions or comments they want to share, please feel free. This is an open space now, and you are more than happy. I'm more than happy to take questions from you as well, if you have questions to each other. Yes, let me.
Thank you all for a very interesting session. So we have talked a lot about the role of business, but I was wondering, also in your experience for the Swedish businesses, about the relationship with governments, because we touched a little bit about that. But I would like to expand maybe a little bit about what had been your experience with dealing with the Swedish government, and what things had facilitated you including human rights as the social dimension in your businesses, or maybe what had made your life more difficult. If we can touch a little bit on that political regulatory environment being more conducive to including the social dimension in business. Thank you.
Hi, this is Martin from Taiwan. I was just wondering that, of course, we would like to our just transition plan and our human rights due diligence action plan to be more inclusive. But sometimes this action plan or transition plan are done by consulting firms or law firms, but those firms represent the best interests of corporations. So how do we make a mechanism to make sure that the potential people suffering from human rights violations, their best interests are represented by those firms?
Maybe just on the latter, in terms of the due diligence, etc. I think the UN Guiding Principles gives a pretty good framework for that, and I think vulnerability and your kind of potential or actual impact is what you need to determine, and you should do that assessment with the stakeholders that are relevant for that conversation. So that's obviously the theory. Of course, then the practice is what are the best ways of doing it in different contexts, but then that discussion probably would take quite a while. So maybe that's all I can say, and others who may be better suited in this can take over. In terms of the government element and engagement, maybe I can reflect my personal experience, which is actually not linked to a company. Present company experience, but it's in the context of circular economy as well. So in my previous role, where I was heading sustainability for a very large multinational Swedish company as well, there was a challenge related to circularity of packaging there as well. And in this given context, which was a low mid-income country in Asia, We try to actually work together with a kind of a number of companies locally, but also ILO in a public-private partnership with that government, and actually with the Swedish government as well. And actually it was a really difficult discussion because informal sector was prevalent so strongly. So in that particular country, almost I think almost 90% or even more of different industries were actually in the informal sector. So then asking business to take action to bring the waste collection community to the formal sector seemed like an undertaking which was really challenging. So I'd just like to be reminded that you know, in all of these actions, when we talk about social sustainability, integration in circular economy, in terms of waste, whatever waste it is, I think it's critical to have the government involved. Sometimes in the developing world, the development agencies or supporting, or like in the case of IFC, they are supporting now quite a few initiatives where they are integrating the IFC standards and looking at the human rights aspects, but not in all contexts. So I would say that is a criticality for success, really, is for the government also to understand what is doable and where do you limit the responsibility of a company in the context of, for instance, informal or formal sector.
Does anybody want to? 2 minutes, yeah?
So I can answer your question on a slightly different topic, and I think what we haven't spoken that much about is equality and gender equality, and where I would say that it was driven as a must. You had to do it, and then maybe 10 years ago in Sweden, especially the industry I'm representing, which was finance, which has a poor track record on gender equality and diversity, it almost became like a paradigm shift where we started to realize that it's for the better of the company, because we need to access competence and diverse types of competences and experiences. So it became more of a strategic imperative, I would say, to work with these topics. And I think that's also something which will come when we look at the just transition lens. What are the investment opportunities? Because there are huge numbers of consumers and people out there that wants to buy your services if they can afford them, and perhaps they have different needs. So working with it from a business opportunity perspective, I think also will drive what policymakers can do to incentivize that even further. So I think the gender equality matter showed the way in a way that, at least in Sweden, became, now you work with it because it's important for your building competence for the future. And as a consultant, you need to understand your customers and your end customers, and for that you need diverse perspectives. We cannot just have one type making the decisions. So for us it's absolutely crucial that we have a wide representation in the decision-making forums. So I would say it's sort of, if you flip it around, you can see how much better you get as a company and the more resilient and relevant you can become by actually looking at the humans and the people that you're engaging with or could engage with. So that would be one perspective to it.
I'll pick up on the government question too, if I can, because I just think it's such an important one. And I guess as much to say that just as companies are sort of learning as they go, so too are governments. And if anything, it speaks so much to the capacity challenge I think we have in meeting this challenge moving forward. Governments are really, really struggling with this concept, I would say, at the national and especially the subnational level. Understanding, firstly, how in the world to even direct business on this issue, let alone set up other national plans and how to make this come to life. They often have other full-time jobs. This is an add-on piece to their portfolio. There is an incredible lack of data to establish any kind of national or subnational baseline from which to measure their progress moving forward. And without that sort of, with, I guess, a continually changing pool of talent, a very limited sort of pool of staff that actually understand this concept enough, it's very, very difficult to even achieve continuity, let alone maintain it in what will be a very long-term process. So governments themselves are grappling with this silo-busting question of what it means to really integrate the E and the S just as much as businesses. And I guess to that point, from our perspective, it's all the more important that as we all move forward together, we are sharing very transparently, very frankly, the challenges as much as the successes of how this is playing out in practice, because this really is, we are entering into the biggest phase of mass experimental governance I think we will ever see. And it's only through that learning by doing, for lack of a playbook, for lack of a sort of blueprint, that we will eventually achieve one. And so, encouragement here to hear from you all about how it's looking so far, but also how much there is left to go. And I think just really welcoming that across the board from business as well as government, how this plays out around the world, because each context will be different, but also the need to elevate those universal principles and what can be made consistent, particularly on a human rights level, I think will be the key to achieving this on a global scale.
So I'm also going to answer the government, if I could. So from the Stockholm Plus 50 Youth Task Force, so not me, but we had our leaders contact the government of Sweden, and that's how we get financial assistance to attend the Stockholm Plus 50 conference, for example, and we had the youth delegates from all across the world, including Global North and Global South. It was also through a collaboration with the Swedish government and the Kenya, because they were co-hosts of the Stockholm Plus 50. And so, with really strong advocate and have a really strong connections with this government before all of this financial assistance, I think the example of how also business is connected, how business, for example, has this project in Sweden that's connected, and so it's a really beneficial way to connect with the government and also with the UN in terms of just transition. And so when it comes to business, it's really important to also talk to government, because from my own experience, business is not so mentioned in the UN systems. For example, I think it would be really important to really engage with government who have direct connections to UN systems, for example, and also through that the youth negotiators, for example, can really be involved in this, because some countries, they have some issues with including youth because these financial problems, of course, and because now they have this climate youth negotiations program, that they have this financial assistance and really train these youth delegates who are already assigned to the government. So perhaps through that also they can be involved in business and just transition in the future, because it's really a primary step now, because it's a new program. So in the future, I think it would be really nice to include business, government. I mean, I can't talk about youth really, but just in general, business and government is very important to include all the intergenerational equity, and also with the community to really think about business, because it is also my experience that the business is really in our mind, that really put business as a perspective and really enhancing that perspective in the future discussion and decision-making process, and also the dialogues like this one. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm going to give the honor to Christina, perhaps, if you're still there with us. If you want to close this session, you're more than welcome to. This is our first human rights-related session for this week, and we'll have a couple of more lined up, especially on Saturday. But I'll give the floor to you, Christina, to wrap up the discussions, and perhaps if you want to answer the questions, feel free. The floor is yours.
Dialogue that you have arranged. Maybe I should just end on the note saying that, of course, cooperation with governments are key in transforming a company. And I think on the business side, we are the ones that will have to make this happen in a just way. If you call it just or fair, whatever, to us it's really important that we respect the individuals that work for us and that work around us, basically. And I think in the volatile world that we have right now, with a lot of polarization, we have a war going on in Europe and so on. If there's anything that we as companies can contribute to, it is to stick to our plans and make sure that we do it the best way we possibly can when transforming into for our part, a fossil-free, a largely fossil-free company just in 8 to 10 years.
Thank you so much, and thank you to our audience for tuning in to this very interesting discussion. I've learned a lot, and hopefully you will all be joining us in the next human rights related dialogues that will come later this week. So thank you so much, our distinguished speakers, and also the audience.
And thank you for inviting us.